Good morning. Good morning. It's so nice to see all your faces. Mark and I were kind of scrolling through to see who's here, and we're so glad to see you. I'm reading the scripture this morning, and I just want to give you a little background on what the scripture is about. It's from the book of Luke, and I'm going to kind of set the scene here for you. So it's Sunday afternoon. We know that Jesus has risen. Christ has risen. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, mother of James, has been to Jesus' tomb earlier that morning to prepare Jesus' body, and they found that he was gone. So the stone had been rolled away and the body was gone. And they left to go and tell the disciples. And the disciples responded that this was just nonsense. How could this be? And they wouldn't believe them. And so I will read from the scripture at this point. On that same day, 2 disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. And while they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. They were prevented from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" And they stopped, their faces downcast. The one named Cleopas replied, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place over the last few days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth. Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all the people as a prophet. But our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. All these things happened 3 days ago, but there's more. Some women from our group left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning and didn't find his body. They came to us saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who told them he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found things just as the women had said. They didn't see him." Then Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all that the prophets talked about. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then he interpreted for them the things written about himself in the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets. When they came to Emmaus, he acted as if he was going on ahead. But they urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened and they recognized him. But he disappeared from their sight. And they said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road, when he explained the scriptures to us?" They got up right then and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, "The Lord really has risen. He appeared to Simon." Then the 2 disciples described what had happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread. Blessings with this reading.
This month, as I sat down to write my annual report in preparation for our annual congregational meeting that will happen in May, I found that I was having trouble remembering anything that happened before about March 16th, the day we learned that we would be sheltering in place in Alameda County. The longer we've been in this isolated state, which so far has been a rather biblical 40 days, the more it seems that we've always been here, and the harder it is for me to remember anything that came before. Are you having this experience too? No other national or world event that I've been through so far, not even 9/11, has had this effect on me of creating a sense that the world has changed irrevocably, and there is now the time before the pandemic and the time after the pandemic started, and we will not be returning to the normal of the time before. Conversations that I have with my friends and my family and my colleagues are not about the time before or about what we'll do when things go back to the way they were. We all seem to realize now that we will never go back. The world has changed. And mostly what we talk about now is how we'll continue to get through the times that we find ourselves in right now, or what the near future might look like. I can't help but think that the disciples of Jesus must have had a similar feeling. I mean, their whole world had turned upside down and inside out, and nothing would ever be the same again. These two disciples of Jesus in our scripture this morning walked together on the road to Emmaus, talking about the one big event in their lives that has changed everything. They know there's no going back to the way things used to be. There's only moving forward into an unknown future. I've always loved this particular story of Jesus appearing to the disciples from Luke's version of the gospel. I love the idea that, at least in the way Luke presents things, Jesus first shows up to disciples who are outside his inner circle. We have never heard of Cleopas and his unnamed companion. And yet they are named as disciples of Jesus here. And just as an aside, it's an important aside, the fact that Cleopas's companion is not named may well mean that this other disciple is his wife. Just want to make that clear. There's a woman in the story. I love the dramatic tension that we know that it's Jesus that they're meeting, but they don't know. And it makes us wonder how long it's going to take before they actually recognize him. I love that they do recognize Jesus when they break bread together. And I love the way they describe their experience later. Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road? Some translations put it, weren't our hearts burning within us? It's a perfect way to describe the way it can feel when we recognize that we're in the middle of a holy moment. In addition to my love for this passage, it also calls up in me kind of a sense of longing and poignancy. And there are two things that are especially poignant for me reading it this year. One is that the story describes the pattern that our worship service is based on. Some theologians believe that Luke crafted the story specifically for his readers. They were people who likely had never met or seen Jesus or broken bread with him. That Luke was pointing them to Sunday worship as the place where they would encounter the risen Jesus and have their hearts warmed by faith and fellowship. It doesn't seem accidental to me that the four parts of this passage, Jesus meeting them on their journey, interpreting scripture with them, giving thanks and breaking bread with them, and then departing to witness to the world, those four parts model the ancient pattern of worship that we follow every Sunday. We gather together, we hear and interpret the word, we share a sacred meal every other Sunday, and then we go forth into the world to share the good news. What's poignant for me about this is that we are not able to gather physically to experience this rhythm of worship. And we don't know when we'll be able to do it again in the near future. So when I hear this narrative this week, it's rather painful in the middle of our social distancing and our isolation. Yes, we are gathering. We're gathered right now. We're hearing and interpreting scripture together. We're breaking bread together. We are sharing the good news, but it's not the same. It's not as deeply satisfying to keep these ancient rituals in a virtual space. Another poignancy for me is the disappointment that the disciples name. We had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. Theologian David Lose suggests that these may be the three saddest words in Scripture or in our lives. We had hoped. For the disciples, they had hoped that Jesus would be the one to break the bondage of Rome's oppression of Israel. For us, it might be we had hoped that our sheltering in place would have ended by now, or we had hoped that the peak in new COVID-19 cases would have been reached by now, or we had hoped that there would have been widespread testing by now. And how many times in our lives have we expressed our failed hopes this way? I had hoped that I would have gotten that important promotion. I had hoped that the cancer would be in remission. I had hoped I could have seen my dad one more time before he died. I had hoped that we could have been reconciled. I think there are few things more painful in our lives than failed hopes. And yet, despite the disappointment that's part of this narrative, it is also a story of profound hope and profound possibility. And the first thing in the story that offers me hope is the way that Jesus comes alongside these disciples in all their disappointment and their failed hope. Before Jesus does anything else, he does this. He asks the disciples to name their loss. The question he asks, "What are you talking about?" as you walk along, is not the idle question that one stranger might ask another. It's not, "How's it going?" or "What are you up to these days?" Instead, it's Jesus asking the disciples to be vulnerable, to be willing to name their pain so that their burden might be shared. Naming our pain, our grief, our loss is essential if we're going to be able to move beyond it. And by moving beyond loss, I don't mean to say that we can erase the pain or leave it fully behind us. That's not possible. But that by naming our loss and our pain and sharing its burden, we can transcend it so it no longer defines us. In other words, naming our pain creates room for us to be surprised by God. The disciples had believed that Jesus would be a warrior who would physically liberate them from bondage. And they didn't understand that Jesus was a love warrior who came to liberate them spiritually. They may have misunderstood what Jesus came to do, but their pain and grief are real. And once they have named it and shared it, they're more ready to recognize a new way to encounter Jesus and to be surprised by God's decision to show up just where they least expect God to be. Jesus meets the disciples on the road. And this is more than just a symbolic representation of the gathering rites of our worship. This is an actual promise that Jesus always meets us where we are, whether in celebration or in mourning, whether in victory or defeat, whether in gladness or sorrow, whether in times of health or sickness, or even in a pandemic. We are on a journey as individuals, as a congregation, as Christians, as a society, both national and global. And Jesus regularly shows up midway through that journey while we're still on the road to encourage us, to accept us, and to embolden us. Another way I find that this is a story of hope is actually the way that it takes the disciples a good deal of time before they recognize Jesus. And they are not the only ones in the Gospels. In John's Gospel, the Pharisee Nicodemus is introduced in chapter 3, but he doesn't demonstrate his faith in Jesus until he buries Jesus in chapter 19. All four of the Gospels record that the disciples have these reactions of doubt and disbelief and dismay and confusion when the news of the resurrection comes to them. None of them believes it right away. And here, Cleopas and his companion don't recognize Jesus until he breaks bread with them. Sometimes faith comes easily, and other times faith can be pretty darn hard, and Jesus remarkably difficult to recognize. Either way, Jesus is there waiting patiently for those that he is calling. No matter how much I'm struggling to see Jesus right now, this story assures me that he's already present. All the disciples who walked with Jesus during his ministry thought that they had lost him to death and violence. They didn't realize that they had to find a new way to walk with him. We too had a particular way of walking with and recognizing Jesus in the time before the pandemic. We are being called now to reconsider our walk. How can we walk with Jesus while we're sheltering in place? How do we recognize Jesus in others when we remain isolated? How do we spread the good news when we can't even leave the house? Friends, I'm not sure yet just how we'll answer these questions in the days to come, but I do know this for sure. Jesus meets us where we are, whether we're on the road or sheltering in place, whether we're filled with disappointment or with hope, whether we recognize him yet or not. He is coming alongside us, asking us to share our burdens and inviting us into that unknown future, into a new walk with him. Amen.